and this is relevant to the issue of suffering, right? And confronting suffering dead on, to actually focus your attention on that which you would like to avoid.
One of the remarkable parts of that story is also that one of the scariest words ever is, if I was God, they wouldn't have been bitten in the first place, right? So they've got the serpent's on the pole, but they're still going to get bit. And I think that's what's essential about that, is just because the serpent is there, it doesn't mean that everything is fixed. It now looks
Snakes are still there.
But the transformation that takes place is the focus of the suffering becomes a symbol of faith for them. And that's obviously in the cross.
Well, and part of the faith is the faith that enables them to go look at the serpent to begin with.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that leads us to the next part, which is in John, because Christ says, thousands of years later, that he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. It's like, okay, what in the world is going on there? Because that's a hell of a thing for anyone to say about anything ever. And it's right, because what does that mean? Why would the Son of God compare himself to a serpent, and why that particular serpent and that serpent in the wilderness? And I knew this old idea that lurks in all sorts of stories, in this corpus of stories that I talked about. You know, there's an idea that the hero rescues his father from the belly of the beast. That's a very, very old idea. And what that seems to mean to some degree is that if you look into the abyss, then that, it reacquaints you with the wisdom and possibility of your tradition. It's something like that. It forces that. It forces a maturation and a recognition of what's fundamentally important, that confrontation with what's terrifying. Well, so Christ says he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. I thought, what does that mean? I thought a lot about the relationship between the serpent in the Garden of Eden and the idea of Satan, because there's an association there between those two ideas, and that's a very strange association too, because there's nothing in the biblical story in Genesis that indicates that the serpent is Satan. Like that's an idea that aggregates across hundreds of years or thousands of years, that equation. And I tried to think that through. I thought, well, the snake is the thing that threatens us. And that's true biologically. We're wired to be afraid of serpents, especially poisonous ones, and they've been in an antagonistic relationship with mammals for like 60 million years, very long time. But in some sense, the idea of Satan is, he's the ultimate in serpents. And so that's why that equation is drawn across time. It's like, well, what threatens you? Well, snakes. Yeah, they're pretty nasty. Well, there's snakes, and then there's, well, the origin of snakes. So maybe you conquer a snake, and that's one thing, and maybe the next thing is you go out and you find nests of snakes and you root them out. But then there's the snakes that are in the hearts of your enemies. That's a harder snake to deal with. And then there's the snake that's in your heart, and that's the hardest snake to deal with, right? And that's where the equation between the serpent and Satan comes, because the worst of all snakes is the serpent in your own heart. And so there's a psychologization of the idea of the predator, and it becomes something that's more spiritual. It's that you're most vulnerable to the worst impulses within you, right? That's the worst predator. Okay, so there's the idea of the concretization of the idea of the serpent becoming psychologized up into this figure of the adversary himself, and that abides within you. Analogously, perhaps, is this reference that Christ makes to himself in relationship to the snake. Because I thought, well, what's the passion? If the snake is what you're afraid of, in this concretized sense, then the passion is the sum total of all possible fears. I think that's right. You know, Carl Jung, he thought about the story of the Passion as an archetypal tragedy. And here's what he meant by that. So imagine that you took all the tragedies that were ever written, and you distilled them so that you got the ultimate tragedy. Because the fact that you can identify a bunch of different stories as tragic means they have something in common, right? And so you could imagine you could pull out the central pattern of tragedy, and we could flesh out some of what that might be. Like, it's tragic when something bad happens to someone. Well, what if they deserve it? Okay, well then it's not so tragic. It still might have an element of tragedy, but it's really tragic if something really terrible happens to someone who clearly doesn't deserve it. So what's the most tragic story? Well, it's the worst possible thing happening to the person who least deserves it. Well, that's core to the Passion story, that's for sure, right? Because not only is Christ innocent, he's not merely innocent, he's also good, and not just good, he's as good as it gets. And yet, his life is the tragedy of the Passion is the worst of all possible punishments visited upon the least deserving person. But it's way worse than that. That just barely begins to scrape the surface, because it's torture, and a terrible torture, because the Romans designed crucifixion to be a terrible torture, like consciously. And so it's tragedy at the hands of your fellow man, and your fellow man motivated by the spirit of Cain in the most fundamental sense. How can I inflict the most misery possible in the shortest period of time, let's say, subject to that, at a young age, with foreknowledge, as a consequence of betrayal by your best friend, at the hands of a mob of your own people who are simultaneously under the thumb of a tyranny that's part and parcel of what's persecuting you, who persecute you knowing you're innocent, not just innocent, but also good, and who choose to punish you instead of punishing someone they know to be criminal. It's all of that. It's like the sum total of all possible fears. And I think that's right. And it's so interesting to me that psychologically, that not speaking religiously to the degree that that's possible when speaking about such things, is that our culture has put at its center an archetypal tragedy. It's as if we're attempting to inoculate ourselves against the catastrophe of life. But what's also so fascinating about the story of the Passion is that the crucifixion is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the resurrection. And so the implication there is the same as the implication of going into the abyss to rescue your father from the belly of the beast. It's like the tragedy isn't the end of the story, the resurrection is the end of the story. And so then you wonder what that means psychologically, because what you see in psychotherapeutic session, in the psychotherapeutic milieu, is that if you get people to expose themselves to what they're terrified of, being terrified isn't the end of the story. Recovering is the end of the story. And so that begs the question is like, well, to what degree are we capable of bearing suffering and prevailing? And the answer might be to the degree that we're capable of confronting it forthrightly. And that might actually just be true. And you think, well, how could it be otherwise in some sense? Like, what's going to call the best out of you if it isn't what's most challenging? Because it's not that easy to get the best called out of you. It's not going to just happen because someone rings your doorbell, right? You have to be shook to the core before you're going to undertake what's necessary to make the sacrifices that are required to put you in alignment. That doesn't happen with no reason. So are you grateful for your suffering as a consequence of that? I don't know. That's a high standard, man. That's a high standard, and maybe it's unrealistic. But
I think one of the things that faith brings us to is, and we were talking about it when we were in the chapel in the Friary, is that when we look at the cross, and it's very Catholic, is that we always see Jesus there, that the corpus is there. And because you talk about in your chapter about what does it look like to transcend suffering, and what does that individual look like? And in some ways our businesses are similar, right? People are bringing their brokenness to you, and they bring their brokenness to me. But I believe in a God that can transform that. So I was asking myself, well, what does that look like? And I recall a priest that I met in Africa, and I believe what he had was Lou Gehrig's disease. So by the time I met him, he was no longer able to really move his arms or legs very well. And we were praying that the Lord would heal him in that. And then he began to share his story with me and what had taken place in he and his community in the midst of his sickness, in the midst of his suffering. Was he said, people didn't used to go to church very much, but since I've been sick, people are coming. And that they wouldn't line up for confessions, but since I've been sick, there's a long line of people coming to confession. He said the church was half full and now it's packed. He said people begin to speak and they say that I'm more empathetic, that I'm more compassionate, that I'm more loving, that I'm more kind. And I'm embarrassed to admit that at that moment, as he was sharing his story about the transformation that was taken both in he and in the community, I was praying, Lord, please don't heal him. Because if we believe that this is what I want to be, right? I want to be loving, and I want to be kind, and I want to be generous, and I want to be empathetic. But I don't want it to be through the cross. There's got to be another way that we can discover that. So, wouldn't it though, right? But the fundamental key to the central Christian reality is it's through that cross that we are transformed. It's by, one thing I was reflecting on, Jesus embraces his cross, his suffering, and says yes to that. A yes which I just can't
and
imagine.
Mary says yes to it too.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Because she offers her
that's the
son
question
to
that I want to talk about is which is more difficult for he does.
Hey, good question.
Thank you.
I'd rather not
Just a
do
second.
either.
Good question. Thank you very much. I think we're done. Thank you for coming. Right? But isn't that in fact the case? Is that when Jesus embraced his suffering, he gives life to the world. He breaks the power over this evil one, over the snake, and gives life. Suffering is no longer meaningless. Actually, it's salvific. But the same thing happened with this priest in this community in Nairobi, Africa, is that he embraced the suffering and it transformed him, yes, but it also transformed the community around him because they saw the way and the manner with which he suffered. And he embraced that and he found that to be transformative. Isn't that what it means when you talk about transcending this? And you talk about how the impact that can have on another person watching. That's what the invitation, that's what the gospel is inviting us to.
Yeah, that seems right to me.
Okay, so how do you reconcile this? Thank you. Another point.
Reconcile them in what
So
sense?
you tell the story, and you tell the story beautifully of the passion and the resurrection, but how do you personally approach that? How do you reconcile this reality?
I think that's what you try to do in your life. You know, I mean, this is an idea that I derived, I would say in large part from reading Carl Jung. He talked about, psychologically again, about the two great ideas about Christ. You know, there's the idea in John, and that Christ is the Word that was there at the beginning of time and at the end of time. It's this temporally eternal divine Word, impersonal in some sense almost.
What do you mean by that? Impersonal?
Well, because it's something that extends from the beginning of time to the end of time isn't so evidently human, you know? It's elevated beyond the confines of what's merely human. But it lacks something as a consequence of that too, right? It lacks time and place. Yeah. And the way Christianity...
The nature of the incarnation.
Yeah, exactly. It bridges that gap. I had a student once who asked me, why don't we just tell the same archetypal story over and over? Why do we need all these variations? And I thought, that's a really good question. I'm not exactly sure about that. And then I thought, it's related to this issue, is that there's the divine Word, but there's the incarnation, and the incarnation indicates that the specifics of time and place are just as important as the eternal that surrounds it. And so then I would say, well, that's probably true in each of our lives, is that, well, how do we reconcile this? And well, that's your ethical adventure, how you reconcile that. And we each do it in our own way and with tremendous difficulty, I would say, and we do it aided and abetted if we're fortunate by people that love and care for us. But that is the challenge, you know, a huge part of the challenge of life. And this is something I tried to concentrate on in this last chapter, is how do you bear the suffering that is at the crux of life without becoming tempted and embittered? That's really, really difficult. Now, you know, someone might point out, go ahead and be bitter, see where that gets you. And if you have any sense, and generally people have at least some, they know that being sick and bitter is worse than just being sick. And that being, right, it's worse, but it's very hard temptation to avoid. Sometimes you want to be bitter just out of spite, in some sense, because things are so terrible, all you've got left is your willingness to shake your fist, you know, and say, well, you know, really? Is this like this many poisonous snakes? Really? That's like, maybe I could have learned with just one or two, not 100. And so, but we're all stuck with that. And I think we're stuck with it at every level of our life, in some sense, is how do we maintain a high order moral orientation in spite of suffering and malevolence.
Yeah, when I was a young seminarian, one of the things that I struggled with, I worked in a neonatal intensive care. In this summer, I baptized over 20 babies, and all the babies died. And it was very, I was a seminarian, I was supposed to have all the answers, right? And they'd come to me and they'd say, tell me real quick, why did this happen? This God, why did he allow this to happen? And I came to the place, a couple things. One is that I didn't have to defend God. Like in my own mind, in my own heart, there was something very freeing in that. I don't know why. I mean, what kind of explanation? Let me explain to you why this happened. Oh, well, thank you so much, brother. Yeah, that makes sense. I wish somebody would have told me that, right? But what I did, but what I would continually come to is that, and this is a mystery of the faith, that Jesus is present in the midst of the suffering. And I tell this story. Actually, the first book I wrote was on freedom, and I spent a lot of time in that Exodus text because that's the invitation to look at Pharaoh and be freed in that. But that when we're children and we fall down and we scrape our knee, our mom comes and she kisses us and she pats us on the head and said, "It's going to be okay." And it is. I mean, really, what has she done? She's kissed me on the head and she's patted me, she said, "It's going to be okay." But we grow up and we don't think that's enough anymore. But my experience tells me is that when Christ can do that for me, in the midst of my brokenness, in the midst of my suffering, in the midst of my pain, and remind me that I'm loved, right? I remember sitting in the chapel, it was a Thursday evening as a seminarian, trying to figure all this out and hearing the Lord breaking in the midst of that and say, "Dave, I love you." And I said, "Well, I appreciate that, but that's not the issue. Let me explain the issue. What am I supposed to tell these people?" And he reminds me that I'm loved, and it's enough. It's enough. And it's the Christian mystery of suffering, that it ought not be something that we try to escape, but it's actually an invitation that we continually find Jesus, because I suggest that when we find God in the presence of the suffering, we can find him anywhere. It's easy to find him in a sunset or in a baptism. Take a brand new baby, pour oil all over him and grease him up, and it smells the chrism. It's wonderful. It's easy to find him in that. How about cancer?
Yeah,
and divorce, and infertility, that when we can find, and that it's the mystery of our faith that God enters the messiness rather than just fixing it from the outside. He enters this and takes this upon himself and transforms it. When we find him there, I suggest we find him anywhere. My experience is that our faith becomes more real, it becomes more authentic, it becomes more present when we can find him in the midst of that.
Yeah, well, that what would I say about that? Well, I guess one of the things I would say about that is that perhaps it looks like, we have something difficult to do, as it turns out. We might think, and why wouldn't we, that we would rather that things were easy and pain-free, and fair enough. But that isn't what our life is like. It's extremely difficult. It's difficult to maintain. An ethical orientation in the midst of malevolence and suffering. And that means, in some sense, and I suppose this is part and parcel of the Christian story, that we have some divine calling. It's something like that. It's like, and that divine calling is to establish what's good in the midst of what isn't.
To be Jesus in the midst of it. To be Christ.
Yeah,
You
well,
speak of
well,
that.
and
You
then
speak of
that's
that.
the question. See, I guess I don't know exactly what to make of that. Because I don't know to what degree we're called on to find Christ in the middle of that, let's say, or to be lifted